Hello guys, welcome back. I'm Megan from Minding My Soul. Today I'm going to be going through part 2 of the kombucha brewing process, which is bottling and flavoring your kombucha for its second fermentation. So if you haven't watched part 1 yet, I would highly recommend just going back, giving it a watch to see all of the steps it takes to get to this point. So before we get started, let's go over some of the things you're going to need. First and foremost, we'll need our freshly brewed batch of kombucha. This jar has been fermenting for about 16 days, so you can see a really nice thick white layer on top. This is going to be my new culture. So shortly I'll show you what we're going to do with that culture as we continue on with the bottling process. Next you're going to need sugar. We won't add that much more sugar to each bottle, but adding the sugar is what's going to kind of influence that second fermentation and add the carbonation. We'll need funnels because it's really impossible to pour from a large jar like this into skinny top bottles. And then you're going to need bottles. So I like to use 16-ounce swing tops. One, I love being able to experiment with a lot of different flavors, so doing it in the smaller quantities gives me the option to try a lot of different flavor combinations on one batch of kombucha. And then the swing top is great because during the second fermentation, this is when carbonation is going to be added to the kombucha, so having a really nice tight seal is going to keep all of that air locked inside. You can definitely use larger bottles for the second fermentation for ease and convenience, but again, if you really want to try with a lot of different flavors, I recommend using the 16-ounce bottles. So we'll also need all of the ingredients you're going to be using to flavor everything. So that can be any assortment of fresh fruit, fruit juices, fruit purees, herbs, spices, just anything you're going to be using to flavor your kombucha. So I'm going to show you 4 of my favorite flavors along with setting up a brand new experimentation flavor, which is going to be a hop to grapefruit flavor. So I haven't tried that yet before, so don't take my word for it. But the other 4 flavors I show you are all really delicious, and I highly recommend them. So let's get started. Alright, so first we're going to want to remove our culture and store it in a brand new jar. So wash your hands really well before you do this. It's definitely going to get messy, so I would recommend having some towels on standby. But you're just going to kind of grab your giant piece of bacteria and yeast. So as I mentioned in video 1, this is your SCOBY, which is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. I'm probably going to trim that later, but I won't take the time to do it now. To store it, you're just going to place it in a jar, and then you're going to cover it with about 1 to 2 cups of the kombucha. So this will become your starter liquid for your next batch. So just kind of fill that up in there. Make sure there's enough kombucha to cover the culture. Sometimes it's easier to store it in like a flatter, rounder glass Tupperware container, but for now I'm just going to keep it in here. So just use your fabric and rubber band from the kombucha, and we'll just set that to the side. So that's going to be stored at room temperature. It doesn't need to be stored in the fridge, and it's good to go for about a month before it would need to be fed. I usually brew another batch before I hit that time, so I never worry about feeding it, but you can definitely find resources online that tell you how to feed it if you're not going to be brewing that often. So let's go into the first flavor. Is probably the most simple flavor, and it's one of the first flavors I ever made, which was ginger. So to make ginger kombucha, you're really just going to take chopped fresh ginger and place it into the bottom of the bottle. Oops. So just kind of shove the pieces of ginger in there. I would say you want to add about a tablespoon of ginger. Kombucha is definitely an art of experimentation, so it might take some time to lock down the perfect quantities for you. I never measure anything when I'm making, when I'm flavoring my kombucha. I like to just kind of put in whatever looks about right, but it ends up being about a tablespoon of fresh ginger. Okay, so now we're going to add about a teaspoon of raw sugar to this bottle. So I like to keep 2 funnels, one for adding kind of the dry ingredients and one for adding the wet ingredients, just because I'll kind of do one at a time and kind of go forward. So just add a teaspoon of sugar, and then we'll grab the jar. We're just going to carefully pour this kombucha into the bottle. So you're going to want to fill the kombucha about 3/4 of the way full, maybe a little bit more. In these bottles I tend to go right to the base of the long neck and then a little bit higher. You definitely want to leave some room in the bottle because as the carbonation is produced, that's going to add to pressure. But you don't want to leave too much room because then it won't carbonate as well. So that's where this is all just kind of one giant science experiment and figuring out what works for your bottles, what works for your kombucha recipe. I'm going to add a splash more. So that's bottle one. And all you do is seal it off. What I recommend doing is taking like a chalk pen or a label maker and just making a note of your flavors, that way you don't forget them and don't get them confused. I mean, later on it's really easy to tell what they are just by smell and taste, but it's just helpful to know what you've put in each bottle. So just set that aside. Next, I'm going to do chamomile lavender. This is probably my favorite of all the flavors I've made. Maybe my second favorite, but it's definitely really easy, and even if you don't love florally things, it's actually really subtle and tastes just really great. So I definitely recommend giving it a try even if you're not the biggest fan of floral flavors. It definitely is interesting. So again, put the dry funnel on and just kind of carefully pour the lavender right down the funnel. Again, I do about maybe half a tablespoon. And then I'll add the chamomile flowers too. Alright, so I've added my chamomile. Now I'm just going to add a teaspoon of sugar. And then again, carefully pour kombucha into the bottle. Alright, so chamomile lavender is done. Seal that off. And then I'll just make a note of what it is. Alright, so on to the next flavor. We'll do chai spice. So chai spice is kind of just a thrown together mix of warming spices. So I end up actually putting an entire cinnamon stick into the bottle along with some ground allspice, a few whole cloves, one or two black peppercorns, actually maybe like 3, some ground nutmeg, a few cardamom pods, some fennel seeds, and lastly, just a few more pieces of fresh ginger. Good, and then I add a full teaspoon of raw sugar. Once you've done this a few times, you'll definitely notice that you get the hang of it, and it becomes a much more streamlined process. Next flavor is probably my second favorite flavor, and that's rose cardamom. I wasn't sure how this flavor would turn out, and this was kind of an experimentation in my last batch, and I loved it. So it's definitely going to be a regular flavor for me. So for this one, all you're going to do is use rose petals and cardamom pods. I definitely would recommend crushing up the rose petals a little bit, because in the past I've kind of struggled with them getting stuck as I'm straining them when it's time to drink them. So if you kind of they crush really easily into kind of a powder. So I would just crush them in your hand. And then add like 4 or 5 cardamom pods. And same thing, you can actually crush these open so that the seeds kind of come out. Sometimes I keep a mortar and pestle nearby so I can kind of crush any harder herbs or spices before adding. Sugar. And the last flavor we're going to do is going to be a brand new experimentation, which is going to be a dry hopped grapefruit kombucha. I have no experience in working with hops, so this is totally flying off the cuff. I got some hop pellets from a local brewing supply store. I think in the future I'm going to try getting my hands on fresh hops instead, but this was a really low risk way of giving it a try. So all I'm going to do is add hop pellets straight to the bottle. I have no idea how many to add, so I'm going to add 10 and we'll see what happens. Maybe a few more. Okay, actually I added about 15. And then I'm going to add the teaspoon of sugar. And then I'm going to add about 2.5 ounces of fresh grapefruit juice. So I freshly squeezed this, although you could probably use actual grapefruit juice too. By actual, I mean like bottled grapefruit juice. So funnel, and we'll pour the kombucha in there. Good. And we'll cap it off. So out of my approximately a gallon batch, I usually end up bottling about 5 bottles. When I get to all 5, if I find that I have a lot left, I'll look and see if any of the bottles can use a little bit more. Usually after the bottles have been sitting for a while, any of the herbs I added might have absorbed some liquid and settled a little bit. So there might be a little bit more space in that bottle. So I'll kind of just top off any of the bottles with more kombucha. If they're all kind of filled to their max capacity, then what I'll do is either add some of that extra liquid just to the starter liquid jar, or I'll even drink it. There's actually no harm in drinking this kombucha that's only gone through its first fermentation. The only difference is there's going to be no carbonation because it hasn't been sealed off and been allowed the time to go through the second ferment. But I never throw it away, don't waste it. If anything, just add it to your starter jar, and that'll go into your next batch of kombucha. And then now all we're going to do is put these bottles in a dark and cool place and let them ferment at room temperature for another 2 to 7 days. I usually find that 4 is like the golden number. I'll let them ferment for 4 days before straining them all out into a batter bowl and then rebottling them. And that's about it. As I said before, the starter liquid and the culture can sit at room temperature for up to a month before needing to be fed or used again. I usually wait just about 2 weeks in between. You'll notice when in your starter liquid that another culture goes on top. You'll also see that, as you continue to brew, your culture, the original culture never goes away. It just kind of starts to not be as healthy. So you definitely want to trim your culture every few brews and only keep like 2 or 3 of the discs at a time, because it just gets really bulky. Like I said, I'll probably take this out and trim it. It was already getting a little crazy, but for sake of time, I didn't do that now. And so that's about it. If you have any questions on brewing your own kombucha, please feel free to reach out to me through my blog or in the comments. I would love to answer any questions you have. I'm definitely not an expert in any of this. I'm still just experimenting myself, but I really encourage anybody to give this process a try because it's really fun and rewarding. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time.